To millions of wrestling fans who grew up watching the sport in the golden age of television, the name Yukon Eric conjures images of a barrel-chested giant in plaid wool and bare feet. A man so physically imposing that opponents would literally bounce off his chest like rubber balls hitting a brick wall. He was one of the most recognizable and beloved wrestlers of the 1950s. A genuine strongman, a fan favorite, a gentle soul who once jumped into a frozen quarry to try to save his drowning dog. But the story of Yukon Eric is not just a story of triumph and spectacle. It is one of the saddest stories in the entire history of professional wrestling. A story that begins in the timber country of Washington state, rises through championship gold and historic television moments, takes a horrifying turn in a Montreal ring, where a piece of his body was torn away in front of thousands, and ends in the parking lot of a church in Georgia on a January morning in 1965. This is the full story of Yukon Eric. Eric Holmback was born on April 16, 1916, in the small town of Monroe, Washington. Monroe sits about 30 miles northeast of Seattle, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. It was timber country, logging country, a place where physical strength was not a luxury, but a necessity, where men worked with their hands and their backs and measured each other by what they could lift, what they could endure, and how long they could keep going when every muscle screamed at them to stop. Young Eric grew up in this environment with 3 sisters. There was no brother to roughhouse with, no male sibling to test himself against. But that did not matter, because Eric Holmback was built differently from just about everyone around him. Even as a young man, his physical development was extraordinary. His chest, in particular, seemed to belong to a creature from mythology rather than a kid from a logging town in the Pacific Northwest. He attended the University of Washington, where he played football. Now, by all accounts, he was not exactly a standout on the gridiron. Researchers who later tried to track down his college football career came up empty. No records, no statistics, no mentions in the sports pages. He was just another big body on the roster, apparently unremarkable in the context of organized team athletics. But here is the thing about Yukon Eric that people would come to understand over the following decades. His gifts were not the kind that showed up in conventional sports. His strength was not the explosive, fast twitch kind that wins football games. It was something deeper, something more primal. The kind of raw, crushing, enduring power that belonged to a different era entirely. The kind of strength that made you think of lumberjacks and frontier strongmen and the men who built this continent with nothing but their bare hands. And it was that strength that would eventually lead him to professional wrestling. Sometime in the early 1940s, Eric Holmback found his way to a man named Man Mountain Dean. Now, if you do not know who Man Mountain Dean was, you need to understand that this was one of the most famous wrestlers in America during the 1930s. His real name was Frank Simmons Levitt. He stood about 5'11" and weighed over 300 pounds. He had been a soldier. He had been a football player. He had appeared in Hollywood movies, including a comedy with Joe E. Brown. He was, in every sense of the word, a larger-than-life figure. And Man Mountain Dean saw something in Eric Holmback. The same thing that everyone who ever laid eyes on Eric saw. That chest. That impossible, enormous 66-inch chest that looked like it had been sculpted by a god with a sense of humor. Dean took Holmback under his wing and taught him the art and science of professional wrestling. The holds, the falls, the psychology, how to work a crowd, how to tell a story in the ring, how to turn raw physical ability into something that could fill arenas and sell tickets. On January 22, 1942, Eric Holmback made his professional wrestling debut under the name that would follow him for the rest of his life. Yukon Eric. The character was perfect, absolutely perfect for the era and for the man portraying him. Yukon Eric was billed from Fairbanks, Alaska. He was presented as a rugged frontiersman, a man from the wild north who had been shaped by the unforgiving wilderness. He wore plaid wool shirts, always open at the front to display that ridiculous chest. He used a clothesline for a belt, and he wrestled barefoot, in blue jeans, like a man who had just walked out of the Alaskan bush and straight into the ring. It was not a complicated gimmick. There was no elaborate backstory, no villainous manager pulling strings behind the scenes. Yukon Eric was simply a strongman from the frontier who could absorb punishment that would destroy a normal human being and then crush his opponents with holds that utilized that extraordinary upper body strength. His signature moves told you everything you needed to know. The Kodiak Crunch, which was a devastating backbreaker across the shoulder, the bear hug where he would wrap those massive arms around an opponent and simply squeeze until they submitted or passed out, and his trademark spot, where he would whip an opponent into the ropes and let them come bouncing back directly into that granite wall of a chest. The fans loved it. They loved him, because in an era when wrestling was becoming increasingly theatrical, increasingly populated by flamboyant villains and scheming managers, here was a guy who was exactly what he appeared to be. Strong, honest, tough, the kind of man you wanted on your side when things went wrong. Yukon Eric spent the early years of his career working various territories across the United States. He wrestled all over the country, building his reputation one town at a time, one match at a time. And on January 30th, 1948, he achieved his first major championship victory when he defeated Sonny Myers to capture the NWA Texas Heavyweight Championship. He only held the title for about a week before losing it to Miguel Guzman on February 6th. But the significance was clear. Yukon Eric had arrived. He was no longer just a colorful character with a big chest. He was a legitimate contender. A champion. After his Texas championship run, Holmback made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He moved north to southern Ontario, Canada, and it was there, in the vibrant Canadian wrestling scene of the late 1940s and the 1950s, that Yukon Eric would reach the peak of his fame and cement his legacy as one of the most popular wrestlers in North American history. On February 15, 1950, he defeated Bobby Manigault to win the Montreal Athletic Commission International Heavyweight Championship. This was a significant title in the Canadian wrestling landscape, and holding it established Eric as one of the top draws in the entire territory. He was headlining cards at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto. He was appearing on television every Friday night. He was, for a brief and shining period, one of the biggest stars in the sport. During this time, Eric lived a simple, almost monastic life. He set up a trailer in Ridgeway, Ontario, a small town near the Niagara region. When he was not wrestling, he spent his time at a campsite, fishing for bluegills and swimming in a nearby quarry. He did not drink, he did not smoke, he did not chase women. He was, by every account, a gentle, quiet, introverted man who happened to possess the body of a Greek god and the strength of a grizzly bear. There is a wonderful story about Eric and a saloon keeper named Joseph Lazar, who owned the Maroon Grill in downtown Buffalo. In 1950, Lazar had taken his young son Spencer to a wrestling show. That night, Eric was actually a spectator rather than a competitor. But at some point during the matches, Eric climbed into the ring and challenged one of the wrestlers. He was promptly thrown out of the arena. The next day, Lazar was looking out the window of his saloon and saw Eric walking by. He invited the big man in for a drink. Eric did not drink alcohol, but he accepted a glass of milk. That encounter grew into a lifelong friendship. Lazar became Eric's business manager, mentor, and closest friend. The Lazar family essentially adopted Eric, who had no family of his own in the Buffalo area. He became a fixture at family dinners and celebrations. Spencer Lazar grew up idolizing the enormous wrestler who would pretend to lose arm wrestling matches to an 8-year-old boy. The stories from that era paint a picture of a man who was larger than life in the ring, but remarkably humble and kind outside of it. Spencer Lazar recalled the time Eric went to a local ice cream shop that offered a free sundae with 24 scoops to anyone who could finish it. Eric finished it. "They probably still talk about that 50 years later," Lazar said. Then there was the time Eric and several other wrestlers went to a restaurant after the matches. The restaurant was running an all-you-can-eat lobster special. The owner was delighted to have these early television stars in his establishment. He asked for autographs, and then Eric ate 6 lobsters. The owner told Eric he would always be a welcome guest, but there would be no more lobster specials for him. Eric drove a convertible everywhere. In the beginning, it was a 1960 Pontiac that he bought with a paper bag full of crumpled bills, paying cash. Later, he moved up to Cadillacs and Lincolns. He was such a terrible driver that he could not even get insurance. On one occasion, while driving to a match with fellow wrestler Ray Dunkel, he lost control of the car and killed a cow. He drove his convertible with the top down in Buffalo during the winter, which is something that only a man with a 66-inch chest and absolutely no fear of the elements would even consider attempting. His popularity was enormous. Spencer Lazar remembered the time the principal of his grammar school called his parents and requested that Eric not drive him to school anymore. The reason was that over 600 of the school's 800 students had been late to class that morning because they were all crowded around the parking lot, staring at the massive wrestler who had just dropped off their classmate. There was also the time Spencer asked Eric to come to a father and son dinner at his temple. Eric not only showed up but brought along Farmer Don Marlin, another wrestler who was famous for having a live pig run around the ring during his matches. Marlin brought the pig to the dinner at a kosher temple. Spencer recalled the look on the rabbi's face when a pig walked into his temple, but nobody seemed to mind because Yukon Eric and Farmer Don Marlin were there. And suddenly, this dinner was the biggest event the Cub Scouts had ever experienced. 100 boys went home that night with one of their happiest memories. But the moment that would define Yukon Eric's career more than any championship victory, more than any television appearance, more than any feat of strength, came on the night of October 15, 1952 at the Montreal Forum. And it involved a man named Wladek Kowalski, better known to the wrestling world as Killer Kowalski. Kowalski was one of the most feared heels in the business. He stood 6'7", weighed around 270 pounds, and wrestled with a viciousness that terrified audiences and opponents alike. He had 2 finishing moves. The first was a claw to the stomach, which looked somewhat comical by modern standards, but was treated as absolutely devastating in that era. The second was a thing of beauty and terror. A knee drop from the top rope, delivered directly to his opponent's throat. It was a move that required precision, and trust. The man on the receiving end had to know it was coming and had to position himself correctly. On this particular night in Montreal, Kowalski and Yukon Eric were in the middle of their match when Kowalski went for his knee drop. But something went wrong. Terribly, horribly wrong. Instead of landing on or near Eric's throat as planned, Kowalski's knee came crashing down on the side of Eric's head, specifically on his right ear. Now, here is an important detail that often gets lost in the retelling. Eric's ears were already badly cauliflowered from years of wrestling. Years of being grabbed, twisted, compressed, and battered had left them swollen and fragile, filled with blood clots and scar tissue. They were not healthy ears. They were the ears of a man who had been in hundreds and hundreds of wrestling matches without any protective equipment. So when Kowalski's knee connected with that already damaged ear, the result was catastrophic. The ear, or at least a significant portion of it, was torn away from Eric's head. The arena went insane. The fans did not know if what they were seeing was real or part of the show. Blood was everywhere. Eric was on the mat, clutching the side of his head, and Kowalski was standing over him, looking down at what he had done. Kowalski later visited Eric in the hospital. And this is where the story takes one of the great turns in wrestling history. When Kowalski walked into the hospital room, he saw Eric lying in bed with his head wrapped in enormous bandages. The wrapping was so large and so absurd-looking that it reminded Kowalski of Humpty Dumpty sitting on a wall. Eric looked at Kowalski, shook his head, and smiled. Kowalski started laughing. Eric started laughing too. Two professional wrestlers, one missing part of his ear, laughing together at the absurdity of the situation. But when the story hit the newspapers the next day, it was reported very differently. The papers said that Killer Kowalski had visited his victim in the hospital and laughed at him. Not with him, at him. The image of this monstrous villain gleefully cackling over the mutilated body of his opponent was too perfect, too compelling, too useful for the wrestling business to correct. And so the legend was born. Killer Kowalski became the sadistic monster who ripped off a man's ear and then laughed about it. And the wrestling business, being the wrestling business, immediately saw the potential. The promoters booked a rematch. And that rematch, held on January the 14th, 1953, at the Montreal Forum, became one of the most significant events in Canadian broadcasting history. Because that match was the first professional wrestling event ever televised in Canada. Think about that for a moment. The very first wrestling match that Canadian television audiences ever saw was a grudge match born from one of the most gruesome injuries the sport had ever produced. The ear match had created such enormous public interest, such overwhelming demand for a conclusion to the story, that it literally launched wrestling on Canadian television. From that point forward, wrestling became a staple of Canadian broadcasting, drawing enormous ratings and turning wrestlers into household names across the country. And Yukon Eric was at the center of all of it. The feud with Kowalski continued for years. They wrestled each other across North America, drawing huge crowds everywhere they went. The fans wanted to see Eric get his revenge. They wanted to see the gentle giant from the Yukon punish the sadistic villain who had maimed him. And Eric delivered night after night, town after town. There is a wonderful line attributed to Yukon Eric from near the end of the feud. He and Kowalski looked out at a particularly small crowd one night, and Eric turned to Kowalski and said, "That is a lousy house. I might have to sacrifice another ear." It was the kind of dark humor that only a man who had actually lived through the experience could pull off. The ear was gone. It was never coming back, but it had also made both men more famous than they ever could have been otherwise. And Eric, at least, could see the absurdity in that. The scar where his ear had been became part of the Yukon Eric mystique. If anything, it made him even more popular. Here was living proof that professional wrestling was not some harmless exhibition. Here was a man who had paid a real, permanent, physical price for what he did. Fans who had always loved him now loved him even more, because he had suffered in a way they could see and understand, and he had come back anyway. He had not run away, he had not retired. He had strapped on his plaid shirt, tightened his clothesline belt, kicked off his boots, and walked right back into the ring to face the man who had mutilated him. That kind of toughness, that kind of stubborn, almost irrational courage, resonated deeply with the working-class audiences who filled the arenas across Canada and the northeastern United States. These were people who understood what it meant to get hurt and keep working. People who went to factories and construction sites and farms every morning with aching backs and busted knuckles, and did their jobs anyway because there was no other option. Yukon Eric was their champion, not because he was flashy or articulate or politically connected, but because he was tough, because he endured, because he was, in every way that mattered, one of them. There is a personal account from a fan who encountered Eric on the streets of Daytona Beach, Florida, in 1964, just months before his death. The fan recognized him immediately, and the confirmation was the ear, or rather the absence of it. Eric seemed pleased to be recognized. They spoke for a few minutes, The fan came away from that encounter thinking how strange it was that this kind, gentle man was involved in such a brutal profession. He also noticed that Eric seemed melancholy that day. Something was weighing on him, something the fan could not identify and did not ask about. Throughout the 1950s, Yukon Eric continued to be one of the biggest draws in Canadian wrestling. He formed a legendary tag team partnership with Whipper Billy Watson, the most popular wrestler in Canada. Watson was a national hero, a man so beloved that he could fill arenas from coast to coast. And when Watson teamed with Yukon Eric, the combination was electric. Together, they won the NWA Canadian Open Tag Team Championship multiple times. Their first reign began on February 13, 1958, when they defeated Fritz von Erich and Gene Kiniski, two of the most feared competitors in the business. They lost the titles about a month later to Stan and Reggie Lisowski, but won them back again. Later, Eric also captured the tag titles with the legendary Indian wrestler Dara Singh as his partner, defeating the Lisowski brothers on August 7, 1958. And on December 28, 1961, Eric and Watson reunited to win the NWA Canadian Open Tag Team Championship once more, defeating John and Chris Tolos. Eric wrestled all the big names of his era: Gorgeous George, Dick the Bruiser, Angelo Poffo, Hans Schmidt, Don Leo Jonathan. He traveled the world. He competed in territories across North America. He was, for the better part of 2 decades, one of the most recognizable figures in professional wrestling. But even during the height of his fame, there were signs of the loneliness that haunted Eric Holmbach. Despite the crowds and the championships and the television appearances, Eric was fundamentally a loner. An introvert, a man who preferred the company of his fishing rod and the silence of a quarry to the noise and chaos of the wrestling business. He had no family in the areas where he lived and worked. The Lazar family in Buffalo provided a surrogate home, but it was not the same as having his own family, his own roots, his own people. He spent long stretches alone in his trailer in Ridgeway, Ontario. When he was not wrestling, he had nothing but time and silence and his own thoughts for company. Later in his career, his main companion was a fellow wrestler named Ray Dunkel, with whom he would share enormous meals, including a famous Thanksgiving dinner where the two of them consumed an entire 20-pound turkey in a single sitting. He also had a beloved boxer dog named Tex, who lived with him at his campsite near the quarry. One winter, the quarry froze over, and Tex ran out onto the ice and fell through. Eric, without hesitating, jumped through the hole in the ice to try to save the dog. He nearly drowned. The fire department had to rescue him, but Tex did not survive. And Eric, this massive, powerful man who could crush opponents twice his size without breaking a sweat, cried for weeks over the death of his dog. That story tells you more about who Eric Holmbach really was than any championship reign or television rating ever could. He was a man of enormous physical strength and enormous emotional vulnerability. A man who could absorb a knee drop that tore off his ear and come back for more, but who fell apart completely when he lost something he loved. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Yukon Eric's career began to slow. He was getting older. The injuries were accumulating. The territories were changing. New stars were emerging. The business was evolving in ways that did not necessarily favor a barefoot strongman in plaid wool who relied on crushing bear hugs and the immovable wall of his chest. He moved south to Florida, where the wrestling scene was still vibrant and where there was always work for a veteran with name recognition and a willingness to put younger talent over. He continued to wrestle, but the glory days were behind him. The massive crowds at Maple Leaf Gardens, the historic television broadcasts, the championship gold, the thunderous ovations from fans who adored him, all of it was fading into the past. And then Eric made a decision that would lead to his destruction. He married a wrestling fan. The details of the marriage are scarce. We do not know her name with certainty. We do not know when exactly they married or how they met. But we know that they had children together, 2 daughters and a son by some accounts. And we know that for a brief time, Eric Holmback had the thing he had always lacked. A family, a home, people who belonged to him and to whom he belonged. But the wrestling life is brutal on marriages. The endless travel, the weeks and months away from home, the physical toll, the loneliness, the temptations. Even for men who, like Eric, avoided alcohol and other vices, the sheer absence was often enough to destroy a relationship. You cannot build a home if you are never in it. And while Eric was on the road, doing what he had always done, what he was built to do, his wife made her move. She sold their house. She cleaned him out of every asset he had. And she took the children to an undisclosed location. When Eric came home from the road, there was nothing left. No house, no money, no wife, no children. Everything he had worked for, everything he had earned over more than 2 decades of professional wrestling, was gone, vanished, like it had never existed at all. For a man as emotionally vulnerable as Eric Holmback, for a man who cried for weeks over the death of a dog, the devastation was total. He had spent his entire adult life absorbing physical punishment that would have broken most men. Knee drops to the head, bear hugs that squeezed the breath from his lungs, the literal removal of part of his ear. Through all of it, he had kept going. But this was different. This was not a physical injury that could be treated or endured or worn as a badge of honor. This was the annihilation of everything that had given his life meaning outside the ring. His children were gone. His home was gone. His future was gone. And the loneliness that had always been there, lurking beneath the plaid shirts and the massive chest, and the adoring crowds came flooding in to fill the void. On January 16, 1965, Eric Holmback drove into the parking lot of a church in Cartersville, Georgia. Some accounts place the church near Atlanta. The exact location does not matter. What matters is that on that morning, in that parking lot, Yukon Eric ended his own life. He was 48 years old. He left behind 3 children who would grow up without their father. Children who would have to piece together who he was from wrestling magazines and old television footage, and the stories of strangers who remembered a gentle giant with a ruined ear and a 66-inch chest, who once ate 24 scoops of ice cream in one sitting. The wrestling world mourned, but it moved on. The wrestling world always moves on. New stars rise, old stars fade, and the memories of men like Yukon Eric get compressed into footnotes and trivia questions. The wrestler who lost his ear to Killer Kowalski, the guy with the big chest, the barefoot strongman from the 1950s. But that reduction does a disservice to who Eric Holmback really was and what he meant to the people who knew him. He was a man who brought joy to hundreds of thousands of fans across North America. A man who helped launch wrestling on Canadian television. A man who could fill arenas from Toronto to Montreal to Buffalo to Boston. A man who drove a convertible with the top down in blizzards, who paid for cars with paper bags full of crumpled bills, and who once showed up at a kosher Cub Scout dinner with a fellow wrestler carrying a live pig. He was also a man who was profoundly alone for most of his life. A man who craved connection but did not know how to sustain it. A man who found his purpose in the ring but never quite found it outside of it. And when the one attempt he made at building something permanent was ripped away from him, he did not have the resources, emotional or otherwise, to survive the loss. In 2007, more than 4 decades after his death, Yukon Eric was honored with the Cauliflower Alley Club's posthumous award. It was a belated recognition of a career that deserved to be remembered for far more than a single moment of violence in a Montreal ring. It was an acknowledgement that this man, this gentle, powerful, heartbreaking man, had made a lasting contribution to the sport he loved. The irony of Yukon Eric's story is that the moment he is most famous for, the EAR incident, was ultimately not the thing that defined his life. Yes, it made him more famous. Yes, it launched a legendary feud and helped bring wrestling to Canadian television. But it was a physical injury, a wound that healed, more or less. A scar that became part of his character, part of his legend. The wound that killed him was invisible. It was the wound of abandonment, the wound of losing everything that mattered, the wound of realizing that all the strength in the world, all the championships and the fame and the 66-inch chest could not protect you from the cruelties that human beings inflict on each other outside the ring. Professional wrestling has always been a business built on characters who are larger than life. Men and women who seem invulnerable, who absorb punishment and keep fighting, who get knocked down and always get back up. It is a mythology of resilience, of toughness, of the indomitable human spirit. But behind every character is a real person, and real people break. They break in ways that audiences never see and that wrestling magazines never report. They break quietly, in trailer parks and hospital rooms and the parking lots of churches in small Georgia towns. Eric Holmback broke, and the wrestling world lost one of its most colorful, most beloved, most genuinely good human beings. The sad truth is that Yukon Eric's story is not unique in the history of professional wrestling. Too many wrestlers have met tragic ends. Too many have struggled with loneliness, with financial ruin, with the devastating emptiness that comes when the crowd stop cheering and the lights go dark. The wrestling business has gotten better about addressing these issues in recent decades, but the fundamental problem remains. These are people who give their bodies and their souls to a profession that often gives very little back when the spotlight fades. Yukon Eric deserved better. He deserved a longer life. He deserved to watch his children grow up. He deserved to sit in a rocking chair somewhere and tell stories about the time he ate 6 lobsters in one sitting, and the time he jumped into a frozen quarry to save his dog, and the time Killer Kowalski's knee came crashing down and changed his life forever. He deserved to grow old, and he did not get to. But what he left behind endures. The footage of his matches, the stories told by the people who loved him, the championship reigns and the historic television broadcasts, and the memories of fans who watched him on their flickering black and white sets every Friday night and believed, truly believed, that this barefoot giant in plaid wool was the strongest and bravest man in the world. And maybe, for a little while, in those smoky arenas, under those hot lights, with those roaring crowds on their feet, he truly was. Like and subscribe for more wrestling biographies and stories from the golden age of professional wrestling. Until next time.